sorry. Hi, good afternoon to all of you. How are you? Fine to hear that. On the behalf of the research group of the Applied Linguistics of the Faculty of Languages of our university, we are greatly honored and pleased to present our today's guest, Dr. Naomi Shin, from the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, who will dictate a conference titled "Does English Impact Spanish in the US? Evidence from Bilingual Children's Patterns of Morphosyntactic Variation." Okay, let me tell you a few words about our speaker. Dr. Naomi Shin currently holds a joint position in the University of New Mexico in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, and also in the Department of Linguistics. Her primary interests include bilingualism and child language acquisition. Her research focuses on morphosyntactic variation in childhood, and whether the variation patterns could be influenced by the language contact. She has studied varieties of Spanish of different regions in Mexico and in the US, including New York City, Washington, Montana, and more recently in Mexico. She has and works with spoken corpora of monolingual and bilingual children from Mexico and the US. Naomi's research topics are related to the development of constraints on morphosyntactic variation, in particular Spanish subject pronoun expression, variable clitic placement, and more recently subject-verb word order. At the University of New Mexico, she teaches the following classes: Spanish Social Linguistics, Language in Society, Language Change, Spanish-English Bilingualism, Spanish in the US, Childhood Bilingualism, Advanced Spanish Grammar. Last, among some of her publications, last year she co-edited a book titled Subject Pronoun Expressions in Spanish, a cross-dialectal perspective, and she has published numerous articles in peer-reviewed journals and also presented in congresses relevant in her discipline. Finally, she's also just a fascinating person, and we are all here for her conference today. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Shin.
Thank you so much for that lovely, lovely introduction. And thank you to all of you for coming today. Mil gracias y mil gracias a los profesores de la Facultad de Idiomas y sobre todo a Rocío Molinos Landero, que ha sido una anfitriona par excellence, por excelencia. So thank you, really, thank you so much for coming today. This is a very nice audience. Do I need to, can I take this and not be stuck here? Can I do that? Yeah, I'm so short that I'll, okay. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about English influence on Spanish spoken in the US, but I've really had an incredible last few days in Tijuana, and I think it would be interesting at the end of this talk. I'm getting feedback. I don't know if is that okay? Yeah? Or like that? Is that annoying, the feedback? Yeah. Oh, that one? Okay. Bueno. Mejor. Sí, gracias, Rocío. So I think it'd be interesting at the end of this talk to reflect on what I'm going to present today and how it might be relevant to Spanish spoken by bilinguals in Tijuana. Because I think that what you have here in terms of bilingualism and the socio-linguistic situation is particularly fascinating. You have a confluence of many people coming to Tijuana from various places, including people like yourselves who are bilingual, right? Okay, so The question I'm really looking at is, it has to do with English impact on Spanish. There are widespread beliefs that English impacts the grammar of the Spanish grammar spoken by bilinguals. For example, the Real Academia Española defines Spanglish this way, that it is a fusión de español y de inglés, y que es una modalidad del habla de algunos grupos hispanos de los Estados Unidos en la que se mezclan elementos léxicos, vocabulary, right, words, right, que se mezclan, y también no solo léxicos, sino también elementos gramaticales. And that's what I'm interested in talking about today. You're going to see lexical items, so los elementos léxicos, vocablos, palabras. Yes, there we know there's a lot of mixture. But actually when we turn to our attention to grammar, the story changes, and that's what you're going to see. Okay, and this is, there was a YouTube video that went viral from a Yale University professor who was saying pretty derogatory things about the Spanish spoken by bilinguals in the US, and so lots of us were pretty upset by this. But basically he writes, it would be, I think, deleterious to our culture to allow our language to be contaminated by English, because Spanglish is not a mix of Spanish and English, it is the overwhelming presence of English in Spanish. Now the reason a lot of us, a lot of linguists who work on language contact and who work on the spoken Spanish varieties spoken in the United States, the reason we were kind of up in arms, a little bit upset about this quote, is because that's not what the research shows. Okay, and what I'm going to show you today is that, including when you start to look at even the language spoken by bilingual children, actually we don't see as much mixing as you'd expect in the grammar. Okay, so I'm not saying there's no mixing, but you don't see as much impact from English on Spanish as you would expect. Okay, so is it true? So this is really the broad research question I have for you today. Is it true that there's an overwhelming presence of English in the Spanish spoken by bilinguals? My answer is going to be no. But the study I'm going to present to you today has to do with children that I've studied in Montana. These are children of farm workers who live most of their year in Washington State, and then they go to Montana in the summertime to pick cherries. You could see how beautiful it is, the location they go to pick cherries. And they spend a month or so each summer in Montana, and they go back and back every year. So these are families who reside in Washington State, some in California, Northern California, and they travel every summer to Montana. Why? Well, the cherries, actually, to pick cherries, they actually make decent salaries picking cherries, so that makes them want to go back every summer. And also, there's a school for their children, so while they're picking cherries, their children actually attend school, so that's a nice benefit. The adults in this community, so it's really a community because they go back every summer. The adults in this community were all born in rural areas of Mexico, primarily Guerrero and Michoacan. Okay? And then their children, the children whose language skills I'm going to talk about today, they were all born in the US. Okay, and they're all bilingual, so they speak Spanish at home with their grandparents and their parents, and then they speak English at school with their teachers, with their friends, and primarily English with their siblings. Yeah? So we really have a nice comparison of adults to children. Okay. So the question is, do we find evidence of English influence on these children, these bilingual children's spoken Spanish? Okay, I'm going to start with an audio clip from one child. I'm calling him Gabriel, that's not really...
Unos pantalones con jeans, pero son gray, y un shirt, y tienen un wrestler, y está blue.
¿A ti te gusta wrestling? ¿Quién es tu favorito?
John Cena.
Sí. ¿Y qué hace? ¿Gana muchas veces? Sí.
Y una vez en mi friend's computer, estábamos mirando un video de eso, y una persona Person like choking, pero él casi no todavía one porque pero sabes esas cosas así están así, pero uno y lo pegó y la persona estaba diciendo que va cuando lo agarró y porque lo chocó con un ladder, así nombre y un rope y cuando estaba diciendo give up, el give up y nomás todavía lo pegó porque estaba bleeding en su cara.
Okay, English, yeah, there's a lot of English words in here, right? So we see, let's see, okay, so we see jeans, gray, shirt, wrestler, blue, video of his friend's computer, choking, give up, right? Bleeding. There's plenty of English. And I think that when people who don't really go in and study the pattern, the grammatical patterns, the impression is, oh, this kid's mixing his languages, right? So, is there English inserted into Spanish discourse? Well, we supply lexical. By lexical, I mean just words, right? So we find all these words. We also find in Spanish spoken in this community, we find what we call integrated loan words, so préstamos del inglés. So we see trayando, playando, jumpando, esquipar, to skip, guachale, of course, and tachar. So what's tachar? Can you guess? Yeah. So tachar is this here. We can hit play one more time. See? Daniel, is that?
Like catching?
Oh, we have the audio, but yeah, he's doing it now. It's just cute to listen.
¿Y tú fuiste a la fiesta? Digo, ¿fuiste a la feria hoy? ¿Y qué te pareció?
Bonito.
Y dile los animales que miraste y los animales que tachaste.
Tacheros. No que taché los leopitos y taché como un conejito.
Cute, I know, it's cute. Tache, right? And this wasn't only in this recording. There were other recordings with tache. So tachar is a verb that is actually pretty common in this community, right? So we find loan words, we find English words coming into the Spanish spoken in this community. Here's another example from a different kid. So Julia, so ¿cuál animal tocaste? And Julia says, toqué los conejos, los puercos, los chiquitos, y taché el chico. See? Okay. So, is there English influence on Spanish? Well, in the lexicon, in the words, absolutely. Obviously, right? And that happens in any situation of languages when they come into contact. That is not unusual. There's nothing, I mean, when we say something like Spanglish or mixed language, that's assuming that that's somehow some true mix of languages. But this languages coming into contact is the most normal thing in the world. I mean, most people in the world are multilingual, right? Monolingualism is actually not the norm. Bilingualism or multilingualism is the norm. So words mixing from languages to another is not unusual at all. There's nothing strange about that. It's very common. What about the grammar? Here's where it gets interesting, in my opinion. So, is it true that we find que se mezclan los elementos gramaticales? That's the question we're going to talk about. The widespread belief is yes. I bet everyone in this room is like, yeah, of course, yeah, we mix our grammars, yeah. Well, there's a lot of debate among linguists. So, one hypothesis that I'm going to explain to you right now is called the parallel structure hypothesis. Sounds a little boring, but it's not that boring. So, Carmen Silva Corbalan, who's a well-known linguist who studies this type of situation, has proposed the parallel structure hypothesis, and basically it works like this. If the use of a grammatical structure let's call that structure X. Any structure is variable in Spanish. I'm going to come back to what I mean by variable, okay? So just hold that in mind. If the grammatical structure is variable in Spanish, then, and if the use of the same or similar structure is not variable, or at least much less variable in English, then we predict that there might be English influence on Spanish. Okay, that's a prediction. Now let's talk about what variable means. Oh, so that the usage of that structure will become more English-like. What do we mean by variable? Well, to describe what I mean by variable, I'm going to talk to you about two grammatical structures. One, I'm calling subject pronoun expression. These are, when I say subject pronoun, I'm referring to what you guys typically call los pronombres personales. I'll get back to that. And I'm also going to talk about something called object-clitic placement, que también son como pronombres. And when I say variable, what I mean is, for example, with subjects, you can express the pronombre personal, the subject pronoun, or you can omit it. So it's variable in how you use it, right? So you can say yo voy, or you can say voy, and you mean the same thing. That's what I mean by variable. It's actually pretty simple, right? And with what we call object-clitics, that's like lo, la, los, las, le also. You can, in certain constructions, I'm going to tell you which ones, but in certain constructions, you can put that word at the beginning, la quiero ver, or at the end, quiero verla, and it means the same thing. So that's what we mean by variable, that you have a choice when you talk, right? And we're not that aware of this when we talk, but that's how it works. Okay, so we'll talk about subject pronoun expression first. So in Spanish, you have this variation, and over 40, 50 investigations of this particular structure show that in general, Spanish speakers express pronouns about 20% of the time. So in Mexico, it's about 20% of the time. You guys use your pronouns, like you guys say yo voy instead of voy about 20% of the time. That means that 80% of the time you don't use them, right? In the Caribbean, it gets up to more like 50%. You know, como tú estás, that type of thing, right? Okay, so they say that a lot more, right? Okay, now, so that means it's highly variable. Your usage of subject pronouns is highly variable, whereas in English, what do you guys think? Right, I go. It's almost always expressed, right? We hardly ever drop the pronoun. We do sometimes, but not very much. Okay, so it's barely variable. So the predictions are that you're going to find higher rates of subject pronoun expression in the Spanish spoken by bilinguals. Why? Right, that there'll be influence from the English version, the expression of the pronoun, I go, that so much I, or you, he, will affect how you use it in your Spanish. That's the prediction. Okay, and also, and I'm going to talk about this some more, that there might be less sensitivity to the linguistic factors that guide whether or not you decide to say yo voy or voy in Spanish, because that choice is not random. It's actually affected by a lot of things. You don't notice this when you talk, but when you talk, your choice to say yo voy is guided by a lot of different contexts, and we'll talk about one of them. Okay, so I said less sensitivity to the factors guiding pronoun expression. What do I mean by that? I'm going to talk about one in particular that we call switch reference. It's going to be really simple to you when you see it and you go, oh yeah, that makes sense. So, if you say yo bailo y ella canta, imagine you say yo bailo y canta, just switching from yo to ella, that's what we call switch reference, just switching, actually increases the likelihood that you're going to say ella. Whereas if you talk about the same person over and over again in subject position, so you say yo bailo y canto, the same, just talking about the same person over and over again decreases the likelihood that you're going to express the pronoun. Okay, so it's a pretty simple concept, right? I keep talking about the same thing, I'm not going to express as many pronouns, right? Same subject, same, so I'm going to call that same reference, and when I switch, I call that switch reference. And studies over and over again show that Spanish speakers express the subject pronoun in pronombre personal more often when you switch reference than when you maintain reference. Not surprising, okay? All right. So is there English influence on Spanish subject pronoun expression? Well, if there is, we might expect, like we said, we might expect an increase in the rate of subject pronouns used, and we might express less influence of this switch reference constraint. That's kind of subtle information to know. You guys all do it naturally, but maybe you do it less if you're bilingual. That's the prediction, right? The hypothesis. Okay, so what has the literature said so far? Some linguists find yes, that there's increase in rates of subject pronouns. Others say no, bilinguals are exactly the same as monolinguals. Okay, so there's a lot of debate about this. I know, you're like, subject pronouns, really? Is it that exciting? Well, we have been debating this for like 15 years. We think it's exciting. I don't know. I'm getting tired of it, but other people keep getting into it. It's, you know. Okay, so what about bilingual children? So far, the studies seem to be saying yes. Yes, the bilingual children express more subject pronouns. What does that mean? That they're saying like, él va a la tienda, él compra sus alimentos, él va a la casa, él, right? O ella, nosotros. Okay, so I'm going to describe now one study by Carmen Silva Corvalán, who I mentioned before. She studied her two little grandsons there. You can see them in the picture on the cover of her book. So this was a longitudinal study. I'm going to go this way. So I feel like I'm getting feedback over there. This was a longitudinal study of two bilingual boys in California. Nico is the older brother, Brennan, the younger brother. They were definitely English-dominant bilinguals. If you read examples of this speech, you see it very clearly. They're much heavier English speakers than Spanish speakers. And she studied them between the ages of 1 year old and 3 months to 5 years old and 11 months. So basically from 1 to 6 years old. That's why she calls it in the Spanish and English in the first 6 years. She taped them. Taped. I'm so old. She had digital recordings of their audio, right? She tape recorded, no. And she kept diary notes as well. And she actually ended up with a really nice large data set. She had over 20,000 utterances in Spanish and 8,000 utterances in English that she looked at. So, their subject pronoun expression, pretty interesting. So, Nico, the older brother, between the last stages, between ages 4 and 6 years old, he expresses subject pronouns at a rate of about 42%, and Brennan at a rate of 69%. In a study of mine, of monolingual children in Querétaro and Oaxaca, kids between the ages of 6 and 8 express their pronouns at around 9%. It's a pretty big difference, yeah? So that seems to support this idea that bilingual children will use more subject pronouns in Spanish, possibly due to their English, most likely. What about switch reference? Well, Silva Corvalán found that Nico used pronouns in same and switch reference like adults did, but Brennan, keep talking about the same person over and over again versus switching reference, didn't seem to affect him at all, right? He used subject pronouns 68% of the time, even when talking about the same person, and then he used subject pronouns 69% when he was switching reference. So no impact of switch reference on his subject pronoun use. I've read over 50 investigaciones of this same variable of subject pronoun expression. I've never seen something like this where the person didn't impact their rate of subject pronoun expression at all. So it's quite remarkable, actually. Okay, so in another study done by Silvina Montrud from the University of Illinois and her students, Sanchez Walker, 2015, they studied 35 bilingual children, kind of a little bit of a too wide age range, but okay, ages 6 to 17 years old, 20 of them in Chicago, 19 in New York City. They compared these kids to 20 monolingual children in Mexico, ages 6 to 17 in Guanajuato. And they also, like Silva Corvalán, did find that the bilingual kids expressed more subject pronouns than the monolingual kids, and also that there was some decrease in the impact of switch reference on their subject pronoun use. All right, so let's turn to the Montana children that I talked to you about, the kids of the farm workers. Do the Montana children, bilingual children, produce subject pronouns more often than monolingual children do? Is there any evidence of weakening of switch reference in particular on subject pronoun expression among the bilingual children? So how did I look at this? Well, I took data from 9 bilingual children in this Montana farm worker community. They were all born in the US. They all reside in Washington State when they're not in Montana, and I looked at data from 6 to 8-year-olds. The children were between ages 6 and 8. And I compared them first to 37 monolingual children in Mexico from Querétaro and Oaxaca, who are the same age range, 6 to 8. I also compared the children to adults from their same community. So I took 13 adults from the Montana farm worker community who reside in Washington State. 9 of them were monolinguals, okay? They didn't speak any English. And 4 were bilinguals who were either born or raised in the US. And I had a research assistant who conducted sociolinguistic interviews. Basically, this just means she talked to them and tried to get them to talk in a very natural way, right? And then with the kids, we also did a picture book narration. We showed them pictures and asked them to describe the pictures, mostly to get the kids talking more, right? This is a picture book that a lot of people use for that purpose. From the interviews, so we went through every interview, transcribed all the interviews, right, had them written out, and then from those interviews, we took every single tense verbs, so los verbos conjugados, no? Finite verbs, that either occurred with a subject pronoun or did not occur with a subject pronoun but could have. So places where you can get variation. This means we had to exclude contexts where you don't have variation. So for example, think about inanimates. Do we say, la mesa está aquí, ella está aquí? No creo. So those get excluded. Okay, so I ended up with 2,305 verbs for the Mexico children and 958 verbs for the Montana children. And for the adults, I had 2,614 verbs for the monolingual adults, and then for the bilinguals, 1,351. So that's how many tokens I had. It's always easier to get a lot of tokens from the adults because they talk more, right? Okay, so answer to here's the first research question. Do the Montana bilingual children produce subject pronouns more often than monolingual children do? Well, here you have it. The Mexico children express their subject pronouns at a rate of 9%. Very few subject pronouns. They just don't use them a lot. And the Montana children, slightly higher rate, so 13%, but that was not significant. It's not a significant difference. So I have to conclude, no, there's no clear difference between the two groups. Okay, now let's look at the adults. Remember I had monolingual and bilingual adults? Well, my bilingual adults actually had a rate that was lower than the monolingual adults. So there's no evidence of any increase in subject pronoun use in this community. All right, so to summarize, there's no significant difference between the Mexico and Montana children in terms of their subject pronoun use, and that suggests no impact from English on their pronoun expression, okay? And similar for the bilingual adults. The bilingual adults' pronoun rates were actually lower than those of the monolingual adults, so that also suggests no impact from English on this part of grammar in this community, okay? Is there any evidence of weakening of switch reference on the pronoun use among the bilingual children? So how did I look at that? Well, I had to code each pronoun for different variables. So for those of you who've been in a class with me, a seminar with me this week, you know what this means. But the one we're really looking at is this one, same versus switch reference. So for every token, I looked, did it refer to the same person as the last subject, or did it switch in its reference? I also coded for whether or not it was yo, tú, él, ella, nosotros, ellos, ellas, etc. Tense, mood, and aspect ends up being relevant, but I'm not going to talk about that much. These other, just so you see the kind of work we do, we code each token for a lot of different contexts that are known to influence whether or not Spanish speakers express their pronouns. Okay, and what did I find? Well, this is, okay, let me actually explain this before I show you what I did here for anyone who loves math and statistics. How many of you love math and statistics? 2 people, yay! 3, okay, well for you 3, I love it too. The beauty of regression analyses is that what you can do, now actually it's really cool, even if you don't love math, I'm going to put it in a really simple way. Here's what regression analyses do. You want to know if this influences this, right? But what if there are lots of things that can influence this. You know, in this case, subject pronoun expression. But you can ask this question of anything, right? What regression analyses do, they're beautiful. What they do is they measure how much each factor influences what you're looking at while holding the other factors constant, right? Because what, you know, if you isolate, you say, well, here's subject pronoun use, and we know that at least 7 things might influence someone's subject pronoun use. Well, how do I know if switch reference is the one that matters the most, or the person? And you can ask this question of things that might be much more interesting to you, right? You know, I want to know, I'm thinking of an interesting question. I want to know how likely it is that my child is going to be really good and not use drugs. I mean, that's something that matters to me, right? And I can look at all the social factors that will predict whether or not my child is going to, you know, something that scares me, right? So I can look at gender, I can look at where we live, I can look at, you know, all the possible factors. And the interesting thing about a regression analysis is it'll tell you what matters most while holding the other factors in constant. Do you know what that means, holding other factors in constant? So basically, if you hold other factors constant, that means I can say, well, I'm isolating the importance of one factor among many. So that's actually pretty cool, I think. And the 3 of us think so. Okay, so here's what we find for the adults. So the person and number of the pronoun, yo, tú, él, ella, etc., matters. This just means that it's statistically significant. Switch reference matters, and these other ones matter for the adults too. For the children in Mexico, the top 2 matter. So when they use subject pronouns, it's determined by what the person and number of the pronoun is, and by switch reference. So that thing I talked to you about, switch reference, significantly impacts their pronoun use. And for the Montana children, the same. So I find no decreasing sensitivity to switch reference in this group. In fact, here are the percentages of pronouns used. Now we saw already, Montana kids, they use a few more pronouns, but you can kind of see this distinction is pretty strong. So they use double as many pronouns, basically, well, double in percentage points, as many pronouns in switch reference as in same reference. So they're just like the adults, they're just like the Mexico children. I find no difference. No evidence of English influence on this group's subject pronoun expression patterns. But yes, there's evidence of English influence in other studies. Even today, in our seminar, we saw a small study by Chavez Gonzalez and Castro from their 2 master's students in the program here, who reported a significant difference between a bilingual kid and a monolingual kid, and they saw a pretty dramatic difference in pronoun expression. So that's going to be important for my conclusions that I come to today. So I find no impact, but some other people have, and you saw that Carmen Silva Corbalan has in her study of her grandchildren in California. Okay, next topic. Spanish object clitics. Lo, la, los, las, le, les, me, te. These can occur in pre-verbal or post-verbal position and finite plus non-finite verb constructions like the following. Yo lo quiero ver. This is called proclisis. That means that the lo is before quiero ver. Yo quiero verlo. This is called anclisis. Okay? Proclisis, anclisis. That means that the lo is after the verb. So, if we're gonna hypothesize, we're gonna predict that English impacts Spanish, what do you expect? Do you think there's going to be more proclisis or more anclisis in the bilingual Spanish? Right, so look at the English. I want to see it. What we have is it always is in post-verbal position. So we would predict then that maybe there'll be more anclisis in Spanish spoken by bilinguals, right? So the question is there more anclisis in bilingual Spanish? Well, the studies of adult bilinguals in the U.S. seem to, corpus studies, that's basically just naturalistic speech, seem to say no. One experimental study of children in Canada says yes, but let's see what happens in my data, okay? So the question is, do the Montana bilingual children produce post-verbal clitics more often than monolingual Mexican children do? And is there any evidence of weakening of constraints? So I'll talk about those in a minute, okay? So here are some kids in Mexico, including my kid when we lived there. This was in Oaxaca, and some kids in Washington State. Okay, so first, so I look at, for this study's a little different. Anyway, I have 17 Montana children, and the ages are a little bit, it's a bit of a wider age range. Why? Because these constructions are actually harder to find, so you have to go through a lot more transcripts. So I needed more kids in this study. So the mean age here, the average age was 9, and I compared these Montana children to Mexico children. Ages 6 to about the same age range and same average age. And then I compared them to Montana adults, 10 monolingual, 11 bilingual. I had to extract, here's what I did. I only looked at direct object pronouns, so lo, los, la, las, and it has to be in cases where you can get either proclisis or anclisis. So that means I also excluded these double clitics, como pensó que se la iban a comer. So you could say pensó que iban a comérsela, right? But we think that because of the se, that there's more proclisis than, so we want to isolate just the direct object clitics by themselves. Okay, so I got not as many tokens as the subject pronoun expression because this is just a rarer grammatical structure. It's not as frequent. And I also compared it to some data from other previous studies. And here's what I found. Mexico children, these are rates of anclisis, so the quiero verlo, right? The one that we think should go up if English is impacting their Spanish. We get 29% post-verbal pronouns in the Mexico children. 29%, oh sorry, the one on the left is Mexico children from a previous study, from Mexico City actually, DF. And then these are my data from Oaxaca and Querétaro. Same exact rate, that we didn't plan that, that's pretty cool. Montana children, we did get a little bit of a higher rate of anclisis in favor of the prediction, but it was not significant, statistically significant. So I have to conclude that there's no difference between these groups. So that tells me that no, there's no significant difference between bilingual children and monolingual children with respect to proclisis anclisis rates. Now, what about the adults? Remember there were bilingual and monolingual adults, right? So here are adults from Mexico from a previous study. This is Mexico City. 27% of the time they're putting these pronouns, object pronouns at the end, right? The monolingual adults in Montana seem to have a higher rate of post-verbal object clitics, and the bilinguals have a lower rate. So that's not what we would predict from English. We actually predicted the anclisis rate should go up from English, but no, not in this community. Okay, but again, there's no significant difference between these groups. So the answer has to be no. Bilingual adults, at least in this community, do not produce post-verbal clitics, anclisis, more often than monolingual adults do. Now, here's a nice picture I'm about to paint for you. I love this. So, we're going to look at the kids next to the adults. The children in Mexico, adults in Mexico. Look at the rates of anclisis. They're almost identical. Children in Montana, adults in Montana. Now I have the combined adults. The rates are almost identical. What this picture seems to show then is that the children look very much like the adults in their own community, right? Okay. I'm going to look at one constraint on proclisis versus anclisis, and it's a verb lexeme. What we know from previous studies is that when a verb has a grammatical meaning, I'm going to tell you what that means in a minute, that increases the rate of preverbal, so proclisis. So for example, los estaba mirando. What does estaba mean there? It means progressive, right? And ella la va a rentar. What does va mean there? Does it mean va? Future, right? So here, estar is a progressive marker. It's a grammatical function. When I say grammaticalized verb, we mean that verb has a grammatical meaning. Yeah. And same thing with ir here. Va a rentar, it means future. These are grammar verbs, let's call them, okay? And these types of verbs end up promoting this pre-verbal position of the object pronoun. With less grammatical verbs, we find more inclusives. So la ranita fue a buscarlos. Here, la ranita actually fue, right? Movement, that's the original meaning. That's less grammaticalized. Right? Keep going. Oh, there we go. And quiero verla, quiero is not grammaticalized. So these types of verbs, fue meaning movement, and quiero promote this post-verbal position for the object pronoun, whereas the grammaticalized verbs promote the pre-verbal position. Okay? I'm going to skip through this because I'm not going to talk about it as much. Okay, so with restraints, with respect to this verb lexeme constraint on variable clitic placement, are the bilingual children similar to the monolingual children? So here's how I coded it. I took out every context where you could get either proclusis or inclusis, right, which is the verb lexeme, right, in the finite plus non-finite verb construction. Then I coded this verb. I looked at every single verb in this finite verb position. So estar, ir, querer, like we just saw. Okay, and I split it up between the ones that are grammaticalized and the ones, and then other verbs. And I also looked at the referent of the direct object pronoun, if it was animate or inanimate. Okay, I did again regressions, but here's what I found. The Mexico children and the Montana children and the adults all were sensitive to this verb lexeme effect, whether or not the verb is grammaticalized. So I'm going to talk about that. That's what became important. But look how all the groups are the same, right? They're all showing this sensitivity, this very subtle constraint on variable usage of... Before I even started talking today about this, you probably weren't even aware that you could do this lo quiero verlo. Well, maybe you guys, because you study languages, right? But most people are not aware of this. And then think about these bilingual kids who are doing this exactly like the monolingual kids and exactly like the adults, right? That shows some really subtle awareness of grammatical properties of Spanish. Okay, so here's their effects. They basically, you don't need to worry about what these numbers say, but I'm just going to tell you that they are all using, they're all putting their object pronouns in a preverbal position about the same amount, and same thing for the other verbs, that their other verbs are favoring postverbal position. And here are their actual rates. Here are the adults in the US. Now here, this black bar here shows the rate of anklosis with these grammaticalized verbs, and look how low it is. This means that when you have something like lo estoy viendo versus estoy viéndolo, that you only say estoy viéndolo 8% of the time, and you say lo estoy viendo 92% of the time. So this verb, whatever's in that finite verb position, is having a very strong effect on whether you say lo estoy viendo versus estoy viéndolo. And then with these other verbs like puedo verlo, then you get very high rate of emphasis, not 51% of the time. Then it's like you can say puedo verlo, lo puedo ver, fine, right? You get about the same amount, okay? Now the children in the US, who do they look like? Just like their adults, right? And here's children in Mexico, and who do they look like? Just like the adults in Mexico, okay? So this tells me that the kids are basically learning these grammatical structures based on the patterns of their community, right? Okay, and they're sensitive to these very subtle facts of grammar of Spanish. Okay, so with respect to constraints on variable clitic placement, are the bilingual children similar to monolinguals? Yes. And the children match the adults in their community. And it doesn't seem to have anything to do with English, right? Bilingual children do not produce significantly higher rates of anklosis than the monolingual children do. And guess what? In our seminar this week, Gama and Rodriguez found the same thing, no impact of English on Spanish. So they found that their bilingual kid they were looking at was producing just as much proclusis, right? So no increase in anklosis as one would expect from if English were really impacting Spanish. And the bilingual children in this study were similar to monolingual children with respect to the constraint, so that verb lexeme constraint. They looked the same. You saw that same impact of grammaticalized verbs versus not grammaticalized, right? So we see no influence from English, at least in this community. Children seem to match adults' rates. Okay, so how do we conclude? Is there English influence on the lexicon? Yes, definitely. Is there English influence on Spanish grammar? At least not in this study. In terms of pronoun expression, not in this study. In terms of variable placement, not in this study. Why? Why lexicon but not grammar? This is an interesting question. What I can say is that some studies do find some impact of English on Spanish grammar, right? But why do some studies find it and some don't? That's a good question. So these are just suggestions now. We can think about this together. But one answer I have that I've been thinking about a lot lately is location, location, location. So I don't find any impact from English on Spanish grammar among bilinguals in this Montana rural farm worker community. And in New Mexico, people don't find much impact of English on the grammar among communities in rural New Mexican communities. But a lot of the studies done in Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York find more English impact. What's the difference there? Yeah, city, rural, right? So, Montana and New Mexico, the Spanish speakers that we've studied so far in these areas live in relatively rural areas. And rural communities are known to have tight-knit social networks, right, where people talk to each other a lot. And there's pretty good evidence that in rural communities like that there's greater maintenance of linguistic patterns. So that could be the difference. It could be the rural versus city difference. So, think about Tijuana as a big city. Maybe you find more change in grammar here in Tijuana than we do in, say, these rural Washington communities. I don't know. Community, so instead of location, it's really about community, right? So instead of location, 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 I wrote community, community, community. One question I have is why are some patterns more susceptible to influence from English than others? So in some studies we find subject pronoun, not this study, but in some studies subject pronoun expression seems to be impacted by English and word order too. But ser, estar, for example, and gender agreement in nouns and the variable clitic placement, it seems pretty impermeable to English for some reason. So why is that? That's an interesting question. I don't have a definite answer at this point. Some possible ideas is maybe that these patterns that are influenced by English might be more complex. Maybe they're more complex, and so they're hard. I do have evidence that they are acquired later. So subject pronoun expressions are actually acquired quite late, whereas variable clitic placement pronouns, those patterns, that verb lexeme effect is acquired very early. That seems to indicate that the subject pronoun use pattern is harder, maybe more complex. So that's one possible answer. Pattern complexity. Yeah, so that proclisis versus enclisis is largely constrained by the verb lexeme, whereas subject pronoun expression is constrained by many, many factors. So perhaps the complexity of subject pronoun expression explains why it takes so long to learn for kids, monolingual kids, and why maybe it's more susceptible to influence from English. Not in the Montana community, but in other communities, right? To conclude, one thought, location, 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 or community, community, community. Maintenance we do seem to find more maintenance of variable morphosyntactic patterns in rural and possibly more impoverished communities where you have tight-knit social networks, like Montana. Next steps, other locations. To test this idea that the type of community matters, we need data and studies and investigations from other places like Tijuana. I think Tijuana is one of the most interesting places you could carry out this type of research because you do have a confluence of speakers from so many different places, right? That other question is interesting to me is which structures and why. So why is it the variable clitic placement in Spanish does not seem to be affected by English? Well, maybe because it's acquired, it is acquired early. It's not, so maybe that has to do with it. Maybe it has to do with its complexity. It's less complex. We don't really know yet. We haven't answered this question. Subject pronoun expression, it's acquired very late. And maybe that's its complexity is why it's susceptible to contact-induced change, meaning impact from English. So that concludes my talk, and to conclude, I really want to thank, especially again, I want to thank Rocío Molina Landeros, who has been an incredible anfitriona and has made me fall in love with Tijuana. Really, you guys have an amazing city here. And of course, the Universidad Autónoma de Baja California, and sobre todo la Facultad de Idiomas Tijuana. Yeah, so, and the seminar, the students and the professors who attended the seminar with me this week, it has been so much fun, and I've learned a lot from you guys, so thank you very much.
Hi. Based on your investigation, what can you say on teenagers? Based on your investigation, what can you say upon teenagers?
That's a great question. Wonderful. I did not include teenagers, but I had in my study, in the among the bilingual children, I didn't children. I mean teenagers, not so much children, right? I didn't include them in this study, but I do have some adolescents, and I haven't looked at their data very carefully. I have one 17-year-old whose Spanish to me is so fabulous. He does a lot of, you know, como like all the time, but it's great. The thing is you find this switching back and forth, right? But that doesn't. But when the kids are speaking in Spanish, their grammar is very much Spanish. And that's something that people don't realize. Like you go back to the definition from Real Academia Española, that there's es una mezcla de palabras, de gramática no tanto. Yes, we can find some evidence of some influence from English, but it takes work to find it, and it's not very robust usually. So yeah, but teenagers, their speech is always fascinating, especially the words they use. I love the como like. You guys do that? Yeah.
I have another question.
Hello, I'm Adriana. Well, for me this is very interesting, but I don't know if this question is going to be personal. Why did you interested about this topic?
How much time do we have? Yeah, see, people have to go because it's too long. It's Friday. Okay, so originally, so when I was about 20, which is 23 years ago, I moved to Spain, and I didn't speak Spanish at that time. Y ahora sí lo hablo, ¿eh? Sí di la charla en inglés, pero sí puedo hablar español también. Ok, me mudé a España y empecé a aprender el español y me pareció como si fuera un milagro. No sé por qué, pero dije, wow, este proceso de adquisición es casi como si fuera un milagro. Entonces, cuando volví a los Estados Unidos, dije, quiero estudiar ese proceso de adquisición. So I started to take graduate classes at the City University of New York Graduate Center, just to try it out, linguistics. I didn't even know what linguistics was. And my professor said, yeah, you should do the doctorate here. I said, all right. I mean, it was really like that. It was like, And I thought I would study. Okay, I'll try it. 10 years later. So I started studying second language acquisition, which a lot of people here are interested in. And I liked second language acquisition, but I have a very mathematical mind, and I felt that there were too many factors. And every time I started studying, oh, why is it like that for the second language learning? I said, well, I gotta know what happens in first language. So I started studying how children acquire language. And to me, it became the most I wasn't even interested in children at the time. I didn't have kids. I wasn't interested in other people's kids. Now I have kids, but it wasn't because I thought they were cute, right? That was not it. I was interested in cognition. And I felt that child language was like looking at a window into the mind. Because the way kids talk tells you how the minds work. It's pretty amazing to me that you'll have bilingual, monolingual kids alike, these very subtle patterns of grammar that I have a hard time even explaining what they are to students, right? And kids learn them by age 3. It's amazing. And what we're starting to learn is that children seem to be tracking probabilities. Like they notice how often we say something, and they notice how often we say something in a particular context. That's why I started getting interested in this more than anything. Yeah.
That was long, sorry.
Thank you, hi. So I just have a simple question. Why did you choose those specific locations? Why Montana? Why those sticks in Mexico? Okay, excellent.
So that's an easy question, a fast one. So before I switched jobs at the University of New Mexico, I spent 6 years as a professor at the University of Montana. And you know, when you're a professor and you're spending a lot of time on your work, you try to do your research as locally as possible. So now I'm turning my attention to communities in New Mexico. Yeah. Oh, and New York is because that's where I'm from. That's where I did my doctoral studies. Yeah. Oh, Mexico. I had contacts at la UAC, La Universidad Autónoma de Querétaro. And then Oaxaca, I went there. For my job, I had to lead a study abroad, so there I was for work. Yeah, so it's all convenience, really. Yeah.
Why do people rated in LA are more susceptible for accuracy in English writing than Montana or other places?
I mean, look, we need more. So the question was, why is there more influence from English on the Spanish spoken in Los Angeles than in Montana? Is that right? Yes, yeah, okay. First of all, I would need more studies to confirm. I mean, that might be too broad a generalization, but let's assume for the sake of argument, that's correct. Let's just assume. Because, you know, a few studies in Los Angeles versus one study in Montana is probably not enough, right? But I think if we can make that generalization, then it possibly has to do with the nature of the community. So if you think about a rural location in eastern Washington, some of the counties there have are over 50% Hispanic, and they're very recent arrivals from Mexico, right? So what you have are a lot of monolinguals. And notice in the study I reported, the adults, a lot of them were monolingual. The kids were all bilingual, and then the parents were monolingual. Whereas the work I haven't done research on Los Angeles myself, but I've done a lot of work. Most of my research has been on Spanish spoken in New York, and in New York, it's a much more varied community, right? So you have long-term residents who are Spanish speaking. You have Puerto Ricans in New York who have been there for decades, right? Whereas Washington, it's a newer community, so you have a lot of monolinguals. I think that that's part of the story. And the social networks are rather tight, right? They even talk about it, right, in their interviews. They'll say, yeah, we all go to church together, we all know each other, we know each other here in Montana, but then we spend a lot of time together back in Washington. So they're really tight communities. So maybe that's why. I don't really know for sure, though. Okay, more questions?
I'm sorry. Actually, my question was more regarding that the slang that we have in TJ in San Diego is being more addressed combination with Latino, African, and Anglo mixture. I don't know how to describe it. So how was that not included on the Spanglish references? Because I have friends in the States, and they actually, we have a topic that either in the social networks we address some English and Spanish mixture at the moment that we're trying to post something, and for them it works the same way. We face an individual that that has been raised with all American parents, no contact with any Latinos until college, and they just started to, as a fad, and obviously as a fad it's also developing as a new way of talking, mixing the Spanish. And I was pretty surprised that was not included.
Well, I think that, there are a couple of things here. Okay, so I have a couple of points to make. The first has to do with the difference between lexical items and grammar. So that's actually a really important point. So this study is not at all about words, really. But when you start to study words, man, it's pretty rich, right? I mean, that's what you're referring to, is that there is a lot of fluidity and